Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a tale of clandestine plots, shadowy partnerships, and betrayal at the highest levels. This is the story of Sam Giancana and the CIA, a partnership that blurred the lines between law enforcement and organized crime. A tale of conspiracy, power, and deadly ambition. This story will leave you asking, how far will governments go in the name of national security? And what happens when the enemy of your enemy becomes your friend? What if two of the most unlikely forces in organized crime syndicate and the United States government work together toward a common goal? What if that goal was nothing less than the assassination of one of the most powerful leaders in the world? Sam Giancana wasn't just a mob boss, he was a force to be reckoned with in the criminal underworld. By the time the 1950s arrived, he had risen to the pinnacle of Chicago's notorious outfit. Known for his ruthless tactics and calculating mind, Giancana carved out a vast empire rooted in gambling, extortion, and violent enforcement. But it wasn't just his criminal activities that made him powerful, it was his ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. With connections deep within both the Mafia and the political establishment, Giancana thrived in the shadows, outsmarting those who tried to catch him. His climb to the top wasn't easy. Giancana had to outmaneuver rivals, betray old friends, and make alliances with some of the most dangerous men in the world. His closest allies included Johnny Rosselli, a smooth-talking Mafia lieutenant, and Santa Trafficante Jr., a ruthless mobster whose reach extended all the way to Havana, Cuba. Together, these men formed a criminal network that spanned continents, operating with the precision of a well-oiled machine. While Giancana was busy consolidating power in Chicago, Rosselli and Trafficante were carving out a massive slice of Havana's underworld, working in tandem with the Cuban government before Fidel Castro's rise to power. Giancana's reputation was not just built on his ruthlessness, but also on his charm. He had a knack for getting into the circles of the rich and famous. He rubbed shoulders with high-profile figures, including the likes of Frank Sinatra, whose friendship would later tie Giancana to the world of politics. Rumors circulated that Giancana had romantic liaisons with Judith Campbell, an actress with ties to President John F. Kennedy. At the height of his power, Giancana seemed untouchable, a man who could make or break anyone's career. However, these connections also set the stage for a deeper, more dangerous involvement with the political world, one that would soon entangle him in a covert CIA operation. By the early 1960s, the United States was in the throes of the Cold War, and the pressure to take down Fidel Castro was mounting. Castro, with his communist ideology and his alignment with the Soviet Union, had become a major threat to American interests. The U.S. government, under the leadership of President Kennedy, was desperate to remove Castro from power. But the conventional methods of diplomacy and military action had proven ineffective, and the government was running out of options. That's when they turned to an unexpected source: assistance: organized crime. The CIA, operating in the shadows of the Cold War, needed people with resources and connections who could work outside the boundaries of traditional warfare. They needed someone who could access Cuba and maneuver through its underworld with ease. That someone was Sam Giancana. Giancana's criminal empire had deep ties to Havana, and his Mafia associates, including Rosselli and Trafficante, had valuable connections in Cuba. The CIA saw this as the perfect opportunity to exploit the Mafia's networks to carry out a covert assassination of Castro, one that could never be traced back to the American government. The relationship between the CIA and Giancana was one of mutual convenience, where both parties stood to gain something. For Giancana, this was an opportunity to protect his operations and expand his influence. For the CIA, it was a chance to get rid of Castro without dirtying their own hands. The partnership, however, was not without its risks. Both the CIA and the Mafia had their own agendas, and trust was a commodity neither side could afford to give freely. Giancana's involvement in the plot to kill Castro marked a dangerous turning point in his criminal career. As the Mafia worked behind the scenes to orchestrate the assassination, they faced numerous hurdles. Castro, with his keen sense of survival, seemed to evade every attempt on his life. From poisoned cigars to Mafia goons trying to slip poison into his food, every scheme failed one after the other. But the CIA was relentless, and the pressure on Giancana and his associates grew as each failure pushed them further into the depths of a conspiracy that no one, not even the men at the center of it, could predict. As the operation failed to gain any traction, whispers began to surface in both the criminal world and political circles. Giancana's role in the scheme remained a carefully guarded secret, but behind closed doors it was becoming clear that the line between friend and foe was blurrier than ever. Giancana was beginning to see the risks of his association with the CIA, and the stakes were rising higher than he could have imagined. Little did he know that this alliance, born out of necessity, would soon become a dangerous web from which he would struggle to escape. As the plot to kill Castro continued to unravel, it became clear that the forces at play in this deadly game were much larger and more dangerous than Giancana could have ever anticipated. He had become a pawn in a conspiracy far beyond his control, and the consequences of his involvement would soon come crashing down on him. The question was no longer whether Castro would be assassinated, but who would survive the deadly game of espionage and betrayal that had begun. By the early 1960s, the Cold War had escalated into a dangerous game of political chess, with the United States locked in a tense standoff with the Soviet Union. At the heart of this conflict stood Fidel Castro, the charismatic leader of Cuba, whose rise to power had turned the island nation into a communist stronghold just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Castro's alliance with the Soviet Union sent shockwaves through the American government, creating an urgency to eliminate him as a threat. The pressure on the CIA to find a solution was mounting, and with every failed attempt to contain Castro diplomatically, the agency grew more desperate. For the U.S. government, the traditional methods of diplomacy and military force were proving to be ineffective against Castro's unyielding regime. By 1960, the CIA had initiated Operation Mongoose, a covert campaign aimed at toppling Castro. However, the operation's progress was slow, and its methods were limited. The agency needed a more direct approach, one that could bypass the diplomatic hurdles and get to the heart of Castro's power. And so, the idea of using unconventional allies, the kind who could operate outside the scope of the law, began to take shape. The CIA's plan was simple. They would enlist Giancana and his associates to assist in assassinating Castro. The agency believed that, with their criminal expertise and connections, the Mafia could infiltrate Castro's inner circle and execute the assassination without ever drawing suspicion toward the American government. The arrangement was carefully negotiated, with Giancana understanding that his cooperation would offer him an opportunity to not only remove Castro, but also gain leverage over the U.S. government, particularly when it came to his own criminal empire. Giancana's decision to enter this covert partnership was driven by both ambition and pragmatism. Though he had little personal animosity toward Castro, he recognized the opportunity it presented. The CIA's promise of support and protection in exchange for his assistance was tempting. It wasn't just about taking down a foreign leader, it was about securing his own future. Giancana had enemies both within and outside the Mafia, and his criminal activities had brought him into the sights of law enforcement. Collaborating with the CIA, he believed, could provide him with the necessary cover to avoid prosecution and, perhaps, expand his influence. The first attempts to kill Castro were fraught with complications. Poisoned cigars, loaded with lethal toxins, were smuggled into Cuba with the intent of slipping them into Castro's hands. The plan was simple: get Castro to smoke one of the cigars, and the deadly poison would take care of the rest. But Castro, ever cautious and aware of the plots against him, managed to avoid the poisoned cigars. With each failure, the pressure on Giancana and his men increased. The stakes were high, and failure was not an option. The Mafia's reputation was on the line, and with the CIA breathing down their necks, the consequences of a botched assassination could be catastrophic. The second attempt involved a female operative, a seductive and cunning agent who was supposed to slip a deadly substance into Castro's food or drink. But once again, Castro's paranoia and his network of loyalists foiled the plan. As these repeated failures mounted, the CIA's frustration grew. Giancana and his men began to question whether they could trust the agency. Their criminal instincts told them that the government wasn't as committed to the cause as they had been led to believe. With every attempt on Castro's life ending in failure, a sense of distrust began to creep in. both within the ranks of the Mafia and between them and the CIA. But the game wasn't over. As the failures mounted, another, more desperate plan took shape. Instead of relying solely on direct assassination, the CIA began to explore other avenues to destabilize Castro's regime, ranging from sabotage to encouraging internal revolt. The Mafia's role continued to shift, and Giancana's influence seemed to grow stronger as the agency found itself relying on him more and more. Yet, each failed attempt at assassination, each setback, only deepened the sense of danger surrounding the mission. The most shocking twist, however, came not from a failed plot, but from the growing realization that the line between friend and foe was starting to blur. As the Mafia became more involved with the CIA, both parties began to leverage their alliance for personal gain. Giancana, with his criminal empire on the line, found himself navigating a perilous world where trust was fleeting and alliances were as fragile as glass. The once clear distinctions between government agents and Mafia operatives began to fade, creating an atmosphere where no one could predict who would betray whom or who would ultimately come out on top. The partnership, born out of mutual convenience, was beginning to fracture, and the question loomed large: could anyone truly trust the other in a world defined by deceit and deadly ambition? The stakes were no longer just about removing Castro, they were about survival itself. And for Giancana, the game was becoming more dangerous with every passing day. Each attempt to eliminate Castro had ended in failure, and the pressure was mounting. Giancana and his men, particularly Johnny Rosselli, were growing increasingly frustrated. They had been promised success, but with every failed plot, their credibility with the CIA and their own standing within the Mafia was beginning to erode. For the CIA, these failures were unacceptable. The pressure from Washington to eliminate Castro intensified, and the agency began to push harder, demanding that Giancana and his associates deliver results. Giancana, however, was becoming more wary of his role in the operation. While he had agreed to assist the CIA in exchange for protection and leverage, he was starting to realize that this partnership might be more dangerous than it was worth. Each failed assassination attempt not only made the Mafia look incompetent, but also put Giancana himself in the crosshairs of law enforcement. The more he worked with the CIA, the more he feared that he was becoming a scapegoat in a much larger game. As the failures mounted, new plans began to emerge. The CIA shifted its focus from direct assassination to more subtle methods of undermining Castro's regime. Sabotage, propaganda, and attempts to incite rebellion within Cuba's ranks became part of the new strategy. Giancana, who had once been on the front lines of the plot to kill Castro, now found himself operating in the shadows, using his criminal network to fuel chaos within Cuba. Yet, despite his connections and resources, the operation continued to flounder. Castro's hold on Cuba seemed unshakable, and with each new attempt to topple him, the consequences grew more severe. In the midst of this growing tension, a chilling realization dawned on Giancana: he was being used as a pawn. As the operation faltered, the Mafia's role in the plot became more exposed. The FBI, which had been investigating Giancana's criminal activities for years, began to take a closer look at his ties to the CIA. The more Giancana worked with the government, the more it seemed that his criminal empire was being put under a microscope. What had initially seemed like a mutually beneficial partnership was starting to look more like a trap. Johnny Rosselli, who had been one of Giancana's most trusted allies in the operation, was also feeling the heat. The pressure was mounting on all sides, and he began to suspect that the CIA might not be as committed to the operation as they had led him to believe. The failed attempts to kill Castro had started to unravel the carefully laid plans, and as Rosselli became more entrenched in the operation, he feared that he too might become a liability. The lines between friend and enemy were blurring, and both Rosselli and Giancana began to wonder if they were simply pawns in a game they didn't fully understand. As the operation continued to sputter, the stakes grew higher. The CIA's desperation was palpable, and Giancana found himself caught between two powerful forces: one, the U.S. government, with its promise of protection and leverage; the other, the Mafia, with its unyielding code and its growing suspicion that Giancana was playing a dangerous game with both sides. Trust had begun to disintegrate, and with it, the alliance between the CIA and the Mafia seemed to be on the verge of collapse. With each failed attempt to assassinate Castro, the questions began to pile up. What lengths would the CIA go to in order to rid themselves of an asset that wasn't producing results? How far would the Mafia go to protect their empire, even if it meant betraying their supposed allies? And, perhaps most chilling of all, how long would it take before the entire operation blew back on Giancana, Rosselli, and their criminal network, exposing them to the wrath of both the government and the underworld they had once ruled? The reality was clear: Castro wasn't going down easily. He had survived multiple assassination attempts, each more elaborate than the last, and his grip on Cuba seemed to grow stronger with every failure. For the CIA, the mission had become an all-consuming obsession. They couldn't afford another public defeat, especially with the Cold War in full swing and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union at a fever pitch. The idea of a successful Castro assassination was no longer just a matter of political strategy. It had become a symbol of American power, a way to show the world that the U.S. could eliminate its enemies, no matter how elusive. But for Giancana, the pressure was becoming unbearable. What had started as a way to expand his influence had turned into a dangerous game that could cost him everything. He had entered into this partnership with the CIA to protect his empire, but as the failures mounted, it became clear that his association with the agency was beginning to backfire. Law enforcement was already sniffing around, and with the FBI now investigating his every move, the walls were closing in. He feared that he was being used as a scapegoat, a fall guy in a larger political game he didn't fully understand. Meanwhile, Johnny Rosselli, Giancana's trusted ally, was growing increasingly disillusioned with the operation. He had always been the more pragmatic of the two, able to see the bigger picture. But even he couldn't ignore the mounting signs of disaster. The Mafia had always operated in the shadows, but now they were being thrust into the light, their names and faces tied to a failed plot of international significance. Every failure brought more attention, and with each failure, Rosselli began to fear that the agency was growing more impatient with their inability to deliver. What had begun as a covert collaboration was becoming a public scandal, and the ramifications for the Mafia could be catastrophic. Behind the scenes, the CIA was not oblivious to the mounting failures. Though their involvement in the operation was supposed to be discreet, the repeated failures to eliminate Castro only deepened their commitment. They began to push for more drastic measures, escalating the stakes even further in hopes that one more attempt would finally do the job. Giancana and his men, now desperate for a breakthrough, were pressed to find new, even riskier methods. Some ideas were far more outrageous than anything the CIA had previously suggested. As the stakes climbed higher, so did the danger. The people involved in the conspiracy were becoming more paranoid, more desperate, as they realized the grave consequences that awaited them should they fail. The constant tension, the failed attempts, and the mounting pressure began to take their toll. Giancana, once a man who thrived on control and power, was now at the mercy of forces beyond his control. The operation had spiraled into a disaster, and as the walls closed in, it became clear that not everyone involved would make it out unscathed. The web of deception was tightening, and Giancana found himself facing an existential question: how far would he go to protect himself and his empire? The price of failure was becoming painfully apparent. Every failed assassination attempt was a step closer to exposing not just his criminal empire, but also the CIA's role in the conspiracy. With each passing day, it seemed that the operation's inevitable collapse was drawing nearer. The question was no longer whether they could eliminate Castro, but whether anyone would survive the fallout once the operation finally came to light. As the years passed and the operation to assassinate Fidel Castro failed again and again, the repercussions of the ill-fated partnership between the CIA and the Mafia began to take shape. The once promising alliance had turned into a complex web of distrust, betrayal, and danger. Sam Giancana, Johnny Rosselli, and their associates were now caught in a precarious situation where the stakes were higher than ever, and escape seemed impossible. The CIA, growing more desperate with each passing year, continued to push for results, but it was clear that they were losing control of the operation. Giancana and his men, who had initially been lured into the plot by the promise of power and protection, were now realizing the true cost of their involvement. The failure to kill Castro had already made headlines, but it wasn't just the Mafia's incompetence that had drawn the attention of the public. The investigation into the assassination plots had also unearthed the CIA's covert involvement. While the agency had worked hard to keep their role under wraps, the growing number of failures only heightened suspicion. The more the operation collapsed, the more eyes were focused on the individuals who had been involved. Giancana, already under investigation by the FBI for his criminal activities, was now being scrutinized for his ties to the CIA and his role in the assassination attempts. The consequences of the failed operation were far-reaching, and Giancana found himself caught in a vise. The most immediate consequence came in the form of the FBI, which began to turn its focus squarely on Giancana. Though his criminal empire had always been a target for law enforcement, the revelation of his involvement in the CIA's covert operations made him an even more significant figure in their investigation. The FBI's interest in Giancana intensified, with agents closing in on his every move. He had always been able to evade capture, but now, with the full weight of law enforcement bearing down on him, his situation had become untenable. The Mafia boss was beginning to understand the gravity of his position. Every move he made, every conversation he had was being watched. Johnny Rosselli, once Giancana's loyal ally, was also feeling the heat. The pressure of being involved in such a high-profile operation had begun to take its toll. As the FBI circled ever closer, Rosselli became more paranoid, realizing that his every action could lead to his undoing. The once close relationship between Rosselli and Giancana began to fray as they both navigated the increasingly dangerous world they had entered. The betrayal that had once seemed like a distant possibility was now looming over them. In the world they inhabited, loyalty could be fleeting, and survival often depended on who could betray whom first. At the same time, the CIA was facing its own internal struggles. The failed assassination attempts had not only embarrassed the agency but had also exposed the extent of its collaboration with organized crime. The fallout was severe. In Washington, there were growing calls for accountability, and the CIA's involvement in the failed plots became an increasingly difficult secret to keep. The agency found itself in a precarious position. With the public eye now on them, the question arose, how long could they continue to cover up their dealings with the Mafia? The political fallout of the operation was becoming more than just a public relations nightmare. It was threatening to unravel the very foundations of the CIA's credibility. But even as the noose tightened, a shocking turn of events began to unfold. Rosselli, in a desperate attempt to protect himself, made the bold decision to cooperate with the authorities. He realized that his best chance at survival was to become a government informant, to spill the details of the failed operation and expose the inner workings of the Mafia's ties to the CIA. It was a dangerous game, one that could either save his life or seal his fate. But in the criminal world, survival often meant sacrificing loyalty, and Rosselli was willing to do whatever it took to avoid being caught in the crossfire. For Giancana, the stakes were even higher. He had always considered himself untouchable, but now with the FBI closing in and the CIA's role in the operation being exposed, he realized that his empire was crumbling. The years of power, wealth, and influence had led him to this point, facing the possibility of imprisonment or worse. With the FBI tightening its grip, it was clear that Giancana's time was running out. The walls were closing in, and soon there would be no escape. To complicate matters, rumors swirled that Giancana had kept incriminating records of the CIA's requests, a potentially devastating secret that could unravel the agency's covert operations. This marked the beginning of a dangerous game of cat and mouse. The final betrayal came when the government turned its back on Giancana. In 1966, he was subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury investigating organized crime and his potential CIA ties. Refusing to cooperate, Giancana fled to Mexico, only to be extradited years later. In June 1975, as Sam Giancana prepared to testify before the Church Committee about the Mafia-CIA connection, he was found dead in his Chicago home. Shot in the back of the head, Giancana's murder was a classic gangland hit, but the timing raised questions. Was it the Mafia silencing him for his cooperation with the CIA? Or was it the agency itself, eliminating a liability before he could reveal their secrets? Adding to the mystery, Johnny Rosselli, the man who helped Giancana coordinate the Castro plot, was found dead just months later, his body stuffed into an oil drum floating in Biscayne Bay. The truth about Giancana's death and the full extent of his collaboration with the CIA remain shrouded in secrecy. What is clear, however, is that their unlikely partnership exposed the lengths to which power players will go to achieve their goals and the deadly consequences of such alliance. Thank you for joining us on Mystery Minds, where we uncover the darkest truths hiding in plain sight. This story of Sam Giancana and the CIA is a chilling reminder of how murky the waters of power and morality can become. What do you think really happened? Was it all part of a larger conspiracy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the mysteries that shape our world. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe.